My daughter called me on a Tuesday afternoon in late October, and the first thing I heard wasn't her voice, it was the wind. She was standing outside. I could tell because of the way the sound kept cutting in and out, that hollow echo underneath it all. I'd learned to read the acoustics of her life, the way you learn to read weather. Small signs, reliable patterns. "Mom," she said. That was it, just that one word, and I knew. I'd raised her for 31 years. I knew what her voice sounded like when she was embarrassed, when she was tired, when she was trying not to cry in front of someone who didn't deserve her tears. This was the last one. "Where are you?" I asked. "The parking level, at the mall." I didn't know where else to go. I was already looking for my keys. "Is Rosie with you?" "Yes." "She's in the stroller." "Mom, She stopped. I heard her take a breath. He changed the locks, and his dad told me not to come back to the office. I found my keys on the hook by the door. I put on my coat without sitting down. "Stay where you are," I said. "I'm coming." It was a 40-minute drive from my house to that mall on the edge of the city, and I don't remember most of it. I remember the radio. I turned it off about 5 minutes in because someone was laughing, and I didn't want to hear laughing. I remember the flat gray light of that afternoon, the maples stripped bare, the kind of October sky that doesn't offer you anything. I found her on level 2, near the elevator. She was standing beside a concrete pillar with the stroller in front of her and one bag on her shoulder, a canvas tote, the one I'd given her 2 Christmases ago with her initial on it. That was all she had. My daughter and my granddaughter, and one bag. She looked at me, and her face did the thing it used to do when she was 7 years old and had fallen off her bike on the gravel path behind our house. That split second before the crying starts, when everything is still suspended. I didn't say anything. I just opened my arms, and she walked into them, and I held her until the suspended thing resolved itself into something quieter. Rosie was awake in the stroller, watching us with those serious brown eyes she'd had since birth. I crouched down and touched her cheek, and she grabbed my finger, and I thought, good, hold on tight, that's the right idea. "Let's get you both in the car," I said. "We'll talk when we get home." My daughter, I'll call her Clem, which is what I've called her since she was small, short for Clementine, though that's not her name either. She didn't ask where home was. She already knew. She'd known when she called me. On the drive back, she stared out the window, and Rosie slept, and I didn't push. There's a time to ask questions, and a time to just drive, and I've learned over 63 years to tell the difference. It was only when we were inside, when Rosie was on the play mat in the living room and the kettle was on, that Clem sat down at the kitchen table and started to talk. Her father-in-law had built his landscaping business, or what everyone understood to be his landscaping business, over the past 12 years in the Ottawa Valley. 4 crews, a fleet of equipment, contracts with commercial properties, 2 HOAs, a school board. Her husband worked alongside him. Clem had been doing the administrative side for the past 4 years, scheduling, invoicing, supplier accounts, payroll processing. She was good at it. She had a head for numbers and an organized mind. Both things she got from me, and I say that without apology. That afternoon, without warning, her father-in-law had called her into his office, told her her services were no longer needed, handed her a check for 2 weeks' pay, and asked her to leave the building. She'd called her husband from the parking lot. He hadn't answered. She'd driven to the house they shared, a rental in his name, and found the key didn't work. She'd sat in her car for 45 minutes before she called me. "Did he give you any reason?" I asked. "The father-in-law. He said there was a conflict of interest." She wrapped her hands around her mug. "Whatever that means." "And your husband? Has he called you back?" She shook her head. I drank my tea. There is a version of this moment where I say something comforting, something about how things have a way of working out, how she's strong, how time heals. I've heard those words. I've said them myself at the wrong moments. They feel like being handed a decorative pillow when what you actually need is a tourniquet. What I said instead was, "Who holds the commercial property leases for the business?" She looked up. "What?" The commercial contracts, the HOA agreements, the school board contract. Who signed them? She was quiet for a moment. I don't know. I processed the invoices, but I never looked at the originals. All right, I said, let me look into a few things. She went to put Rosie to bed. I went to my office. Here is something I should explain. 22 years ago, when my marriage ended and I found myself at 41 with a daughter to raise and a life to rebuild, I went back to work in property management. I spent 15 years in that field before I semi-retired. I understand how commercial leases work. I understand what it means to hold one versus to be a named tenant versus to operate under someone else's name. I understand the difference between having your name on a contract and simply behaving as though you do. I had also, in the years since Clem married into that family, paid attention. Her father-in-law was charming. He was the kind of man who fills a room, tall, certain of himself, the sort who picks up the bill at restaurants and makes sure everyone notices. He talked about his business the way men like him always do, as though it materialized through force of personality alone, as though the actual machinery of it, the paperwork, the accounts, the unglamorous work of keeping things running, was beneath mention. I had watched Clem do that work for 4 years. I had watched her manage scheduling software and reconcile supplier invoices and sort out payroll when the processing company sent incorrect files. And I had noticed, the way you notice things when you spent a lifetime paying quiet attention, that her father-in-law spoke about his business in terms that were sometimes slightly, oddly vague. The name of the company had changed once, a few years back. There'd been some issue with a previous business name, something she mentioned in passing and then forgot. I had not forgotten. I spent the next 2 days making calls and pulling records. Property records in Ontario are public. CRA business registration is searchable. The commercial lease agreements, as it turned out, were not difficult to locate because several of them had been filed through a property management firm I knew from my old professional network, and a former colleague there owed me the professional courtesy of a conversation. What I found was not what her father-in-law had been presenting to the world for 12 years. The business had been incorporated, correctly, legally, under a holding company. That holding company had a single named director. That director was not her father-in-law. It was not her husband. It was a woman whose name I recognized because it was the name on the original business registration from 14 years ago. A woman who had since moved to British Columbia and, as best I could determine, had no active involvement in day-to-day operations. But there was more. The payroll processing account that Clem had been working with. She had mentioned once that the credentials had been set up in her name for administrative access. What she didn't know, and what I found when I spoke with a contact at a commercial credit monitoring service, was that someone had been using her scene as a secondary reference on 2 business credit applications made 18 months ago. Not her name, just her number. The kind of thing that's easy to miss if you're not looking, and that can take years to fully unwind. I wrote everything down. I organized the documents into a folder. Then I called my lawyer. She's been my lawyer for 11 years. She's the kind of person who listens without interrupting and asks exactly the right questions in exactly the right order. When I finished explaining, she was quiet for a moment. "When do you want to meet?" she asked. "Thursday," I said, "and I'd like you to send a letter to the holding company's registered address before then." I didn't tell Clem what I'd found. Not yet. She was dealing with Rosie, with the logistics of staying at my house, with the ordinary shock of having her life upended in a single afternoon. She didn't need my investigation on top of everything else. Not until I was ready. Thursday came. Her father-in-law called me Wednesday evening, which told me the letter had arrived. He was warm, conciliatory, the bill-paying charm turned up to full. He said he hoped we could clear things up. He said there'd been a misunderstanding. He said he'd always thought of Clem as family. "I know," I said. "I'd like to meet." We agreed on Friday morning. His office. I told him I'd come alone. I drove to his office in the business park on the edge of Kanata, the kind of low-rise complex where the snow plowing is handled by the property manager and the parking lot is always half empty by 9 a.m. The name on the door was a version of the company name I've remembered. Slightly different from the original registration, the change I'd noted. a logo that implied stability and years of operation. He met me in the reception area himself. Handshake, coffee offer, the full performance. We sat in his office with its framed photos of completed projects and a wall calendar from a local lumber supplier. I put the folder on his desk. I didn't make a speech. I've seen too many people make speeches at moments like this and lose what they were trying to accomplish in the drama of the occasion. I simply explained, in the order I'd organized the documents, what I'd found. The holding company structure, the director of record and her absence from operations, the commercial lease agreements and who had legal authority to assign or terminate them, the credit applications, Clem's SIN. He listened. His expression didn't change much. Men like him have a well-practiced composure, but his eyes did something when I got to the credit applications. A small tightening. The recognition of a problem he thought no one else knew about. When I finished, I closed the folder. Clem is not going to pursue this quietly, I said. Not because she's vindictive, because she has a daughter who is going to need her mother to have a clean credit record and a clear employment history. He started to say something about the complexity of business arrangements, about intentions, about how these things sometimes looked different than they were. The lease on the Gloucester property, I said, is held by the management company. I have a contact there. That lease comes up for review in March. I can't tell you what their decision will be, but I can tell you they're going to be asking questions about the named director. He was quiet. I'm not here to create problems, I said, which was true in the sense that the problems already existed and I was simply making sure they were visible. But my daughter needs her SIN cleared of those applications. She needs a reference letter for her employment history that accurately reflects the work she did. And she needs not to be pursued for any claims relating to her departure. He asked how long I'd known about the holding company structure. Long enough, I said. I drove home through the gray November morning and stopped at the Tim Hortons near the highway because I'd been up since 5 and I needed coffee and a moment to sit still. Clem was giving Rosie breakfast when I got back. She looked up when I came in. How did it go? She asked. You'll get the reference letter, I said, and we're going to sit down with my lawyer next week about the SIN issue. She put down the spoon. Mum, what did you do? I took off my coat and hung it by the door. I'll explain everything over the weekend. But first, has anyone contacted you about employment insurance? She shook her head, slightly dazed. All right, that's where we start. The following weeks were not simple. These things never are. The credit application issue required formal dispute letters to 2 lenders and a process through Equifax that took longer than it should have. The reference letter was written, though it was late and had to be followed up twice. Her husband, she'd spoken to him by then, or tried to. The conversations were brief and circular, the way those conversations always are when one person has already made up their mind and is simply managing the exit. Her husband did not contest the separation formally, which suggested someone had had a word with him about the benefits of keeping things straightforward. The holding company situation resolved itself in ways I was not directly part of. The director of record, from what I heard through my former colleague, had her own interest in regularizing arrangements that had drifted significantly from their original structure over 12 years. Businesses that rely on one person's maintenance of a certain story tend to become fragile when the story stops being universally accepted. Clem stayed with me through that winter. Rosie learned to pull herself up on my coffee table and fell over the arm of the sofa twice before developing a more reliable technique. I started working from my office in the evenings again, not because I needed to, but because Clem was in the kitchen after Rosie's bedtime, working on her upgrade applications, and it felt right to be nearby. She'd had 2 years of a business administration program when she got married and let it slide. She'd been thinking, she told me one evening, about completing it through an online program. There was one through Algonquin that fit around her schedule. Then do it, I said. It'll take a while. Everything takes a while, I said. The while passes either way. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, You knew something was off about them, didn't you? Before all this. I thought about how to answer. I knew there were things that didn't quite add up. I didn't know the shape of it. Why didn't you say anything? Because you didn't ask, I said. and because I could have been wrong, and because you were building a life and you needed to do that without your mother poking holes in the foundation." She thought about that for a while. "I should have asked," she said. "Maybe," I said, "but you know now. And Rosie is fine, and you're here." She enrolled in the program in January. By spring, she was ahead in 2 of her 4 courses, which surprised no one who knew her. I still have the folder from that meeting in Canada. I've thought about throwing it out, but I keep it in the bottom drawer of my desk. Not as a trophy. I'm not interested in trophies. More as a reminder of what it cost and what it was worth, and the distinction between those two things, which is sometimes larger than you'd expect. Rosie is walking now. She has a very determined walk, straight-backed with tremendous purpose, as though she knows exactly where she's going, even when she clearly does not. She gets that from somewhere. I've thought about that folder a lot since everything's settled. The one that's still sitting in the bottom drawer of my desk. I don't take it out often. But sometimes, when Rosie is pulling herself up on the coffee table and Clem is at the kitchen counter with her laptop open and her course materials spread out beside her tea, I think about what it cost to put that folder together. The phone calls, the evenings, the quiet work of connecting things that other people had counted on staying disconnected. People like to talk about consequences as though they arrive from somewhere outside, some force that decides, eventually, to balance the books. I don't see it that way. What I've watched over 63 years is simpler and less romantic than that. People make choices. Those choices have weight, and the weight accumulates quietly until one day it becomes visible to everyone in the room. Her father-in-law made choices for 12 years. He chose to present himself as the owner of something he didn't own. He chose to let a structure persist that served him and cost someone else. He chose, when the arrangement became inconvenient, to discard my daughter in an afternoon as though 4 years of her work had been a favor he was no longer interested in accepting. Those choices didn't go anywhere. They sat in property records and lease agreements and credit files, exactly where he'd left them, waiting for someone to look. I looked. That's all I did, really. I looked carefully at what was already there. I'm not sure that qualifies as exceptional. It might just be what happens when you pay attention long enough to know what questions to ask. Clem is not a passive person. She never was. But she was young and she was building something and she trusted the people she was building it with. That trust wasn't foolish. It was reasonable. The kind of trust you extend to family when family behaves like family. What she didn't yet know, and what I couldn't tell her because she hadn't asked and it wasn't mine to say, was that the structure she was trusting had a crack in the foundation that predated her entirely. She knows now. And knowing, for Clem, has never been a stopping point. It's always been a starting point. That's the thing about her that I was never worried about, even in the worst of it. Not the October afternoon in the parking level, not the long winter evenings when Rosie was asleep and the house was quiet and I could hear her in the kitchen, thinking she was always going to find her way through. She just needed the path to be clear enough to walk. What I hope she carries forward, and what I'd say to anyone listening who recognizes something of themselves in this, is that your name on a document matters. Your SIN, your signature, your access credentials, your understanding of what you've actually agreed to. Not because the world is full of people who will use those things against you, but because knowing what you hold means no one can take it from you without you noticing. Clem didn't notice, and she's not at fault for that, but she notices now. She will always notice now. The weight of what her husband and his father did caught up with them not because of anything dramatic or deliberate on my part. It caught up with them because it was already there. I just made sure the right people were looking in the right direction at the right time. Rosie walks with tremendous purpose these days. Straight-backed, head up, absolutely certain she knows where she's going, even when she's heading directly for the corner of the sofa. I watch her and I think, good, that's exactly right. You keep walking like that.